So building on what I said in the last video about perception and perception filters, we need to, at some point on the spiritual path, come to realize that there are limitations to the mind. I talked about separate selves, but this is beyond the separate selves. Beyond the specific separate self, there is the way the mind works. And this has something to do with the brain and the nervous system and how our brains process information. But it's of course more than that. It's not just in the brain. But you have an old idea that was discovered many years ago that we have two halves of the physical brain. And neurologists say that there's the left brain, which is more analytical thinking, and there's the right brain, which is more holistic or intuitive thinking. Now, personally, as I said, I don't think thinking is determined by the brain or takes place exclusively in the brain, but it is affected by the brain. So let's just use that model. We can say, instead of talking about two halves of the brain, we talk about two different ways of thinking, or two different ways of looking at life, even two different ways of perceiving at the realm of ideas. So we have, well, not everybody has, but those of us who have grown up in the Western, secular, democratic world, we have been indoctrinated from a very young age to think that the only way to think is analytical, rational, logical thinking. Our entire culture, especially promoted by science, deifies the intellect. And when I first found the spiritual path when I was 18, I found the path after a very intense period of my childhood and especially my teenage years, where I had been thinking about life and thinking about the big questions of life. Who am I? Where am I going? Is there life after death? Is life have a purpose? But the way I approached it was largely thinking analytically, intellectually. So I had the typical Western approach to the spiritual path, which is, there is knowledge out there, we have to find it. And the way we find it is through our intellects, our analytical minds. We have to understand. So I thought, for the first many years on the spiritual path, I thought that what really drives my growth is that I come to understand certain things. And this was sort of cognitive dissonance, because I had, from a young age, even as a child, I had these mystical experiences, intuitive experiences. So I knew intuitively there's a reality beyond the material world, but I didn't quite grasp that there's a reality beyond my own mind. I had experienced that there's something beyond my intellectual mind, but I still thought that I could understand that something with the intellectual mind. And it took me many years. I found my first spiritual movement, and I studied teachings there, but they were not really appealing to me so much. But in the second spiritual movement, they had an even vaster body of teachings, and they appealed more to me. So I studied them more, and I was trying to really understand what the teachings were saying. But it was still in the intellect. I was still analyzing. And part of the problem with the intellect is that it's a comparative faculty. It compares one thing to something else. And what does that really mean? Well, it means it must have a foundation for comparing. It must have a standard that it's comparing everything to. And I have explained this in other videos, that you create a worldview. And in any new idea that comes to you, you are comparing it to your worldview. So you could say that the intellect operates much like in the old days you had these filing cabinets where there were individual file folders. Today you have computer databases where you have the electronic equivalent of these file folders. So you can say that the intellect has, in your subconscious mind, it has this file folder that says, this is reliable, this is valid, this is the truth. And so a new idea comes to you, and the first thing the intellect does is compare it to that file folder that says this is safe knowledge, this is reliable knowledge. If it doesn't conform to that, if it doesn't fit into it, then it will look for some other file folder that it might fit into. And you might have another file folder in your mind that says this is false knowledge. And if the new idea corresponds to that, okay, you file away as false. But once in a while an idea will come to you that doesn't fit any of the file folders you have. What do you do then? What does the intellect do? Well, in many cases, it always becomes confused, and in many cases it reacts by saying, oh, this can't be true, I can ignore it. Or perhaps it goes into arguing against it. So what I realized after many years was that you can see in the world how there are these long-standing arguments that have been running. Philosophers have been for centuries arguing about this or that. But just to take one typical example. Many years ago, back in the 1300s, there was some Catholic theologian who wrote down some arguments for why God must exist. And other philosophers have over time come up with arguments for God's existence. And after materialism began to be more dominant in society, materialists and atheists have come up with arguments against God's existence. And they have taken the arguments for God's existence and tried to reason against them and invalidate them. And at one point I really looked at these arguments. I looked at the arguments given from both sides, and I was trying to, in my own mind, I was trying to come up with the ultimate argument that would prove God's existence, so that everybody could see it. But after having been frustrated by this effort for some time, it suddenly hit me in an intuitive experience. There is no final argument, and there never will be. And why? Because the intellect is a relative comparative faculty. It always compares any new argument to what's already in the database. So, here you have an atheist, and he has a file folder in his database. This is valid knowledge based on science. He has another file folder. This is false knowledge. And in that are a lot of the ideas presented by religion. So even if I, with my sophisticated intellectual mind that I thought I had, could come up with some argument that was new, that nobody had ever heard before, what would the atheist do with it? He would first evaluate, does it fit the knowledge that is in my valid folder? And if it doesn't conform to what's in my valid folder, it's automatically filed away in the invalid folder. In other words, he is not actually looking at the argument. He's just comparing it to the database. And so I realized that for centuries, some of the supposedly most intelligent people on the planet have been on both sides of this argument. Some argue that God exists, some argue that God doesn't exist. And of course, you would think that after centuries, if there was a final argument, if there was a final intellectual rational understanding, they should have come up with it. But they haven't. So I suddenly realized, but what if there is no final argument? Because there isn't meant to be. Because this ties in with what I said about perception and perception filters. We must be allowed to create any experience we want to have in the reality simulator, and we must be able to build the sense that it's real. And one of the ways we build the sense that it's real is by this filing system. There's valid knowledge, there's invalid knowledge, so any new idea we can file it away. And this is what gives us this illusion that we have the ultimate understanding, the ultimate truth. And I suddenly saw this and I thought, oh my goodness, I don't want my life to be eaten up by this futile quest. I saw it was just futile. It's like this Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. All this intellectual argumentation that's been going on with philosophers over the centuries, it's just all them arguing from a certain perspective. And you see, when you have the file folder that says, this is truth, but what you think is truth is just a relative perception. It's just one dualistic extreme that you have elevated to being the truth. It's not real. You don't have the truth. I also realized it's not that one side has the truth and the other side has error. Now, I grew up as a spiritual person, but I never really thought that religion had the truth. But it was, of course, tempting to say, okay, then there must be a spiritual teaching that has the truth. But that's what I realized. This is not the case either, because once a teaching is put into words, as I talked about in another video, it has entered this realm where now the intellect can start working on the words. So you have a spiritual teaching that gives a specific worded sentence. And some people will look at this, they will compare it to their subconscious database and say, oh, this corresponds to my worldview, therefore it's not valid. So it's not that, I'm not saying that there aren't spiritual teachings that have true and valid teachings, but they're not the final argument. I thought, in my youthful exuberance, I thought that if I could just get all people to look at my spiritual teaching, they would be as convinced by the teaching as I was, and then we could solve all problems on earth. But I realized this is never going to work, because even if a person was to read my spiritual teaching, he or she would not have the same experience of the teaching that I had, because they're not looking at the teaching through my perception filter, they are looking at it through their own perception filter. So what am I trying to say with all this? I'm trying to say that you can't think your way into heaven. It's not a matter of coming to the point where you have this ultimate understanding that can be expressed in words. Now you have the ultimate spiritual teaching. And now, because you understand everything, now you're ready to enter nirvana, enlightenment, whatever you call it, heaven, salvation, the ascended realm, whatever you want to call it. People think, and I have met many other people on the spiritual path who think the same way, because we were brought up to think that way, that when we acquire the full and ultimate knowledge about reality, we'll be in heaven. We'll be enlightened. But it's not the case. Why? What did I describe in my last video? You're ready to leave Earth when you realize that nothing on Earth is real, and therefore nothing has power over you. So if you think a specific outer word of spiritual teaching is the only truth or the highest truth, and that this defines how reality works, well, you're not ready to leave, because you're still having that experience of wanting to feel that you are special, and that's what keeps you on Earth. So what will then bring us to the ascended realm? Well, as I have been explaining, you shift your perception. And that's not thinking. You're not thinking your way into shifting your perception. If you want to use the model that I've used about these subconscious selves, I said there is ultimately at the top of the pyramid, there is this one self that has the job of making whatever experience you are having through the other selves seem real. It makes you experience that you are in a real world. But below that self are some other selves, and one of these selves is the intellect, or using the intellect to use an analytical, logical, rational process to say, we can prove what's real because such and such and such. But what that self does is it says, and you will see this, if you look at the ideas in the world, they always have, this is our foundation. This is what cannot be questioned. And this is the foundation we are building everything on. So if you accept that foundation, their arguments will seem reasonable and rational. But it's just one way to look at the world. I remember when I was young, I came across this idea that there's something called the privilege of defining the problem. So you have a debate, and it centers around there's a problem we have to solve. But if you have defined the problem, you can set the debate on a certain track. And this is, for example, what, when I was younger, the Marxists in Denmark were trying to do, because they were defining there's a certain problem in society, there's the workers, there's the bourgeoisie, and there's a certain dynamic, and therefore this will inevitably work itself out till we have a Marxist society. And many people were convinced by this because they accepted the basic premise. They didn't want to question it. So then it seemed reasonable. And you can do the same thing with a spiritual teaching. You can say, if there's something here that we don't question, then from that something follows something else. And, you know, you can look at everything I've said here, and you can turn it around and say, well, aren't you doing the exact same thing? And I will say, yes, I'm doing the exact same thing. Because when you are talking in words, you can't avoid this dynamic. Or rather, you can't avoid that people will interpret your words in a different way. Right? A word is not just a word. You have a sun up there in the sky, and you have an apple down here. They're both round. But if in the past somebody had used the word apple to refer to the sun, we would all have been saying, oh, I'm sitting here in the apple eating a sun, instead of I'm sitting in the sun eating an apple. And we wouldn't have thought anything about it. So what I'm saying is, the words, in any spiritual teaching, it doesn't describe reality in words. I tried to say this in some of the previous videos too. A spiritual teaching cannot describe reality in words, because reality can only be experienced. And it can only be experienced when the conscious self steps outside of these subconscious selves and experiences reality as it really is. And then you realize that that reality that's outside your own mind is more real than the sense of reality you have from inside the mind. And that's when you really start making progress, being able to question these selves, because now you don't have this obsessive compulsive need to feel that you are right, because you don't have the obsessive compulsive need to feel that your worldview is reality. You see what I'm saying? When you are inside this pyramid of the subconscious selves, the conscious self is trapped by this top self that says this is a real world and it has power over you. This seems real to you. You are experiencing a certain sense of reality. But the spiritual path is not about validating the reality that you see from inside this pyramid of selves. The spiritual path is about stepping outside these selves until the conscious self sees reality without the selves. And then you realize that when you are perceiving reality without the selves, this is more real than the sense of reality you had from inside the selves. That's when you start really being able to question the remaining selves and start making progress towards the point where I've talked about it earlier as I called it neutral awareness. How are you looking at the world now? You're looking through a particular self, and you're not neutral because you want that self to be right. You want your particular worldview, your ideology, your spiritual teaching to be right, and you want your sense of reality to be right. But when you start going beyond this point of needing that because you see there's a bigger reality outside your own mind, then you can question all of these things. Instead of resisting seeing an illusion, you can now welcome seeing the illusion because it makes you more free. And that's a good place to be.